It is the world famous KROQ. I'm Megan Holiday, and I am here today with the incredibly talented and beautiful Caroline Polachek. Hello.
Hi, Megan. Thanks so much for having me back.
Thank you so much for being here. And the last time you and I talked was at Coachella last year. So it's been about
almost a year.
About a year. And so much has happened in that time, which I definitely want to get to your new album and all that stuff. But I first want to talk about your recent performance on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Girl, you absolutely crushed it. And you have this incredible control over your voice. So how did you feel just going into that performance, being up there all alone and absolutely knocking it out of the park?
Well, it was a funny choice to do it all alone because live, my band eats that song. They eat it. So it was more of a conceptual choice. The song's called Welcome to My Island, and the single artwork is me with my back sunburned in this really strange pattern, almost as if some kind of exotic jellyfish had its way with me. So it's my naked back against this black backdrop, and I was like, you know what? I want to recreate the album art as a performance. So I was covered in sunburn. I mean, I couldn't be fully naked on TV, but I got as close as I could. And sang the song just against this black void. And the song's really this very bratty, ethereal piece of music. And I thought that being by myself would sort of just land the gesture. So I also take my first guitar solo.
Yes, it was, you crushed it. That was your first guitar solo?
I mean, on any kind of stage, yeah.
And on live TV.
I know, the thing about live TV is there's really no way to prepare for it, because you can rehearse something as much as you want, but when the cameras start rolling, the live audience is there, and you have one take, it's such a specific feeling.
Oh yeah, it's so much pressure, really.
Yeah. It's a thrill. It's a thrill.
Oh my gosh. Well, you did so great, and it's so clear that you have this opera training background. Does that give you the confidence to be up there and just know, I'm gonna go all the way up to this really high note, and then you go into the chorus of Welcome to My Island and it's down in this lower register? I mean, how has your opera background sort of helped you?
I mean, my opera training, which was mostly as a teenager, actually, was ages ago. I guess it just helped me learn how to make a lot of sound, for lack of a better word. I don't actually use operatic technique really when I sing, which is to say, don't use a lot of vibrato, and I like to switch notes using a lot of what I call vocal flipping. So rather than and you'd never hear anything like that in opera with those fast changes. But I actually learned a lot about writing from doing opera, from doing Puccini and Debussy and Rachmaninoff. I got schooled by just those melodies, which are incredible.
Yeah, and I read somewhere that you also studied autotune, and now just from hearing you do that vocal thing that you just did, I'm like, oh my gosh, it sounded sort of like autotune. So what does that mean, studying autotune?
I don't know. I think that might have been a rogue journalist who might have written that.
Okay.
But I mean, we're all living in the age of autotune, ever since T-Pain and 808 and Heartbreaks, those albums, or that moment in pop established autotune as one of the main instruments of contemporary music. And we're so adjusted now to hearing tuned vocals, that hearing raw, I was listening recently to, I'm not going to name names, but some epic 90s records that were very important to me, and even my ear now is so adjusted to hearing tuned voices that when you hear people land a little off, it's whoa. So it's interesting because I don't actually sing that in tune. I just really like the texture of autotune. So I'm kind of more responding to the way it feels for the voice to have those hard edges.
And I think it's so refreshing and nice, though. One of the gripes that I have with a lot of music is that it doesn't sound as raw. You go back to stuff that was from the 60s and 70s, and it just has that more gritty realness to it. So I just think it's amazing that you have this confident vulnerability to you. Have you always been that kind of a performer?
Oh my gosh, I used to be so shy when I was first getting, yeah, but I mean, not just as a teenager, but when I was in, when I first began my band, which I was in for ages, called Chairlift, I was so scared to write in front of people. Because singing is one thing, but actually writing, coming up with new ideas, lyrics and stuff, doing that in front of people is really terrifying. So for any songwriters listening in today, I feel like we've probably been through a similar odyssey. But no, honestly, performing live is what got me more and more confident. And also just the idea of, rehearsal, being able to practice and get something the way you want before you show it to people, having that kind of safe space where I could like live with the material before showing it. But then now I'm way more confident than ever, even writing in front of people, tracking vocals without lyrics in front of people, all that kind of stuff.
Well, and maybe, the experience too back, because I know you were nominated for a Grammy back in 2015 because you helped co-write and co-produce a Beyonce song. Going into something like that, I mean, I would imagine that's a little intimidating, but for you, like what you're saying now is to go from not feeling comfortable writing and recording in front of people to then going in and writing for Beyonce. What was that experience like for you?
I'm like laughing to myself because that song that I produced for Beyonce, I made that beat and did all those synths like on my bed in my underwear in a hotel room in London at like 5 a.m. Not knowing I was going to pitch it to anyone. I was just vibing. So it's funny to think about. Yeah, like that was actually an extremely private space. But I think often a lot of my best writing does come from, being able to make these little quiet places.
Mm-hmm. How do you know if a song is yours or if you're going to give it away to someone else?
I think I would actually give like most songs away to the very specific people that could nail them. Like I don't think there's a single song that I like absolutely would not give away. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some songs would only be to dead people. But I always feel like there's someone who can do it better than me.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but I know what you mean, where you're just like, oh, I could hear this specific person doing this part. And you have done a lot of collaboration. Something we bonded over when we first talked was you getting to work with Chino Moreno from Deftones. On this album, you got to, work with Dido and Grimes. So how do you sort of go about when you're choosing who you want to collaborate with? And do you still have some people that are on your bucket list?
This album was really intuitive. I think I made this record with fewer people than I've ever made a record with, actually. I want to shout out Danielle Harl, who's the producer I worked with across almost this whole album. He kind of feels like a brother to me at this point. We kind of have like a very similar way of looking at things. But this record does include the first features I've ever put on an album, which is Grimes and Dido. Grimes and I had just been speaking for ages about wanting to do something together and just never having the right chance. And then when I started Fly to You with Danielle Harl, I was like, wait a minute, this song's really like speedy and it's very pink and feels kind of like very emotional, but also very high tech in this way that I feel like Grimes and I share. Mm-hmm. And so I sent her an early version and she loved it. And then we kind of started getting greedy to like bring another voice onto it. We were like, why would we stop here? Because we knew people were going to be so like surprised to see us collabing. So we kind of wanted to push it even further. So I wrote Dido a letter asking if she'd be on the song with us, kind of not expecting to hear back. And then a couple days later, she FaceTimes me saying she loved the song. And then I found myself at her house recording it with her on her lawn.
Oh my gosh.
So it was all very intuitive, but ultimately the song we did together is like really about beauty and it's like a very beautiful piece of music. And so it made a lot of sense to invite them both in.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely one of my favorites on the album, which is called Desire I Want to Turn Into You. So when you were approaching this album and thinking about what you wanted to write about, did you have specific themes in mind? Because I feel like it flows so perfectly. You can tell that it's an album that was made as an album, not to be just, oh, these are the singles and the rest is filler. It's so beautiful.
I really wanted this record to feel very physical, like to really feel very bodied. And I thought about that a lot, especially with working on the beats, wanting things to feel like they were not being in some kind of deep recesses of an ethereal, reverby digital space, but to feel really like crusty and right up on the speakers when you hear it, to kind of turn the speakers into sculptures a bit. But I was also really inspired, coming out of the pandemic by this idea of catharsis that everyone's sort of looking for and hungry for. And that I started feeling increasingly connected with like ancient history, like all the wars and plagues and various pandemics that we've been through, that our ancestors have been through, and that artists have always gotten us through these times of like total chaos and upheaval. So I started thinking about what I was doing more in terms of like this ancient legacy of artists dealing with chaos. And that, I don't know, it felt very comforting for me to feel like I was part of this history. So I think you can feel that. There are nods to some very traditional music like bagpipes and Spanish guitar and choir. that for me feel very connected to that.
Do you have a song that maybe you're most excited about, or a song that really just came right out of you and it wasn't the hardest thing to make?
Well, they always start that way.
Uh-huh.
It's finishing it that takes forever, but they all, yeah. I mean, Billions, which is the closer
Love
on the
that
album,
one. Mm-hmm.
that was a really fun, immediate, well, starting point at least. Danielle Harl, the producer I was working with, sent me this beat that he'd actually pitched to an Indian artist. So it was using a lot of tabla and like kind of traditional Bollywood instrumentation. And she'd rejected the beat, and I heard it and I was like, can I please have this? I'm in love with it. And I sat down with it on my computer, and just the chords and the melodies and the choir section all kind of flowed out of me like so fast. But then of course the song took like a year and a half to actually finish.
Gosh.
Mostly because the structure was so crazy. It has like 8 verses and 2 choruses, and it ends with a children's choir. So figuring out how to make all these things feel really natural took some experimentation.
So you played Coachella last year. I saw you at This Ain't No Picnic this last year as
Oh my God,
well.
that was so fun.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite festival shows of the year.
It was one of my favorite festivals to go to, and I literally walked in as you were playing,
And the
I
sun
got
was
to,
setting.
It was so beautiful, and I just stood there and I watched you, and I was telling my boyfriend, I was like, I got to interview her last year, and you know, you just absolutely crushed it. So you also played Primavera Sound. You've got so much stuff coming up. So I don't know, just kind of, where is your mind at right now? What are you most looking forward to doing just over the next year even?
Well, all those shows you just mentioned, Coachella, This Ain't No Picnic, Primavera, those were all kind of an excuse for me to start living in the world of this album before it was out.
Right.
So I built this sort of volcanoscape on the stage that for me felt very representative of a lot of the sounds and feelings on the album. I started sort of dressing more in the spirit of this album, and I started playing a lot of unreleased material. And now I feel like that whole show has like grown up and gotten way more dialed in, but we've also arrived. Like the people who are coming to the show, shout out to my amazing listeners, they all know the songs. People have certain expectations how they might sound that I now get to play with. So it kind of feels like, yeah, entering this new chapter where I have to we're doing it for real now. We're doing the Desire show. I'm excited. Europe was amazing, and we're about to hit the road in the US.
Yeah, you're going to be at the Shrine on April 29th.
April 29th.
And you're headlining, right?
Yeah.
This is such a big deal. I mean, that's a big venue. You know what I mean? And then you were telling me you're playing Radio City in
Sold out
New
Radio
York,
City.
which is massive because
I'm
you're
so
from the
excited.
East Coast and everything. And something I did want to ask you about your album cover. You were kind of crawling through a subway, and also your video for Welcome to My Island also ending at a platform to get on the subway.
Mm-hmm. Well, Welcome to My Island was the last thing I released before the album. So that was for me a way of leading people into what's coming next. I've had a lot of fun on this album creating these little, I call them trapdoors, from one side of the album to the other. But the cover, which was so wild and fun to shoot, was shot on a train in London.
Oh, okay.
And there's a bunch of friends of mine, discreetly hidden in the background, but there's a lot of links to the album in there as well, just hidden in the set design. But I was inspired to shoot on a subway because for me, this album is really about living out in the world. My last album felt very internal, very to do with fantasy and internal narrative, and this one feels like it really exists in this overwhelming swirl of things. Like that song Pretty Impossible you mentioned just feels like this train of thought you're having while you're walking down the street and you can't keep your mind focused. You're just da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And for me, the album feels like that. It feels like this kind of windswept swirling of things. And for me, the experience of being on the subway listening to music is like a really precious interaction that I have with music. It's like my favorite place to listen to music. I think because being surrounded by strangers and movement and also being out of communication puts you in this really both dreamlike and also very humble headspace where you're like, yeah, I'm just part of the fabric of this world. I'm very small in this world. I'm like, what does my life mean? Nothing really in the context of things.
Yeah.
So I think it's like a very vulnerable place to listen to music. And I found myself crying on the train all the time because I'm moved by what I'm listening to. So anyway, the cover was a bit of a nod to that state, to like the state that I kind of hope people will experience the album in. Maybe they're not crawling on all fours in the sand on the train. It's optional, feel free. But yeah, just kind of being out in the swirl of things and feeling quite raw.
Everything you make is so beautiful, and anyone that hasn't listened to Desire I Want to Turn Into really need to do it. Listen to the entire album as a whole. Again, Caroline Polachek will be at the Shrine on April 29th.
April 29th, let's
Very
go.
excited, to come out and see you, of course. And I just want to say thank you so much for hanging out with us today and for talking to me. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for watching, and have a good one. It's KROQ.